Buenas tardes, Zara Snapp.
Hello. Buenos dias, Richie. It's
Nice
tomorrow where you are.
I know, we live in the future down here. It's
Yeah.
crazy. Nice to see you. You are in Veracruz, Mexico, where you are stuck at the moment, I imagine, due to the pandemic, huh?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was a decision to leave Mexico City after a month of being there on lockdown and to come to my home state of Veracruz, where my mom is 10 minutes down the road, and create a bubble with her and my son and we adopted a cat, so there's like a lot of changes in our life. Hello.
Hey, little guy. What's the situation in Mexico like with the pandemic? We're all pretty free and easy down here these days in New Zealand. I mean, mild restrictions, but
I
we
know
can't
you guys did your 15 days and then you were done. It felt like they.
Yeah, we've had a mild, like, couple of new cases pop up after I think someone escaped from a hotel where they were meant to be quarantining. But by and large, we got concerts, we got sporting events, everyone's going back to the gym, life progresses.
That's very lucky. Yeah, no, I mean, I think here in Mexico, and they told us this from the beginning, that this would be a long, drawn out period, and that they know that it's unlikely that it's going to be quick. And so, even though they keep being like, okay, so this will last a month, it was all of April, and then it was, okay, now it's going to last all of May, and now all of June, and now they're saying, well, it could be until October. So, and we have around, right now, the period that we're in right now, we're having between 600 and 700 deaths a day, and about between 6,000 and 7,000 new cases, confirmed cases a day. And this is in a population of 120 million people around, just to give you an idea. So it's probably many more, and that they're just not able to track it all.
Wow, is there a social gradient to those mortalities? Like, are your more impoverished communities at a higher rate of death, or is it across the board?
Yeah, so it's not necessarily. Probably there are. It's a cross section, but there's definitely a variable of overcrowding in homes, and that can then make you more likely to die from the disease. And or from COVID. This is something that is across Mexico, right? Because it's many generations living in one home. And so even though we might not think like overcrowding, but it's like maybe 3 people sharing a room or more. And that is not only in urban environments, it's also in rural environments. And so they have found that as an indicator of greater, death rates. And I think in every place, and in Mexico, just as much or more so, and in Brazil too, we've seen this. It's highlighting the inequality that already existed. It's highlighting the state's incapacity to provide services in many cases, or to reach communities in many cases. I mean, I think that in general, I actually think they've dealt with this as well as they could, but they also recognize that diabetes rates are super high in Mexico. Obesity is very high, and all of those are comorbidities that are going to affect you with or without COVID, but COVID just makes it that much more important. And so, yeah, I mean, we saw it from the beginning of people who are able to stay home versus those who have to go to work, or those who work in the informal sector, which is 60% of people in Mexico have an informal job. So it's not like they can go home and continue to receive a salary. They are people who are working in people's homes, or they are shining shoes, or they're selling food outside of a metro, or they're, X number of things that causes them to have to be in public space. And so it is causing us to kind of I think it's important that we're looking at inequality and how resources are distributed, and whether people can actually stay home and take care of their health in that way. And I think that's why the government has been trying to prepare us that this is going to be long, because they recognize that not everyone can stay home. And so if you can, stay home. And if you can't, take these precautions. And yeah, we expect it to kind of go on for until the end of the year, at least. And wow. We'll see how the rest of the world continues to play out. I mean, it's crazy, because this is like the first thing in our lifetimes that has caused the whole world to react. This is like the world war of our generation, I think, in that it is affecting all of us in different ways, but we're all being asked to take care of ourselves, and in that way try and take care of the collective.
Is there government assistance for people who are no longer able to work? Because here in New Zealand, we all got like a government payout, which was significant. Like pretty much everyone was eligible for it. But thinking about the fact that
you guys are so cute in New Zealand. Oh, the Kiwis.
well, I'm just thinking, given so much of the economy in America is informal, and there's no trackable, taxation and yada yada yada. Like, how is the government supporting people who no longer have economic means?
Yeah, they have a couple different programs. I mean, we don't really have unemployment insurance the way they do in other countries. There is something similar to that. But for example, the federal government offered 25,000 pesos, which in US dollars now would be maybe $1,000 to companies as a loan, a one-time loan to companies so that they would be able to maintain salaries for 3 months. But like that can cover maybe one salary for 1 month, depending on what your business is. And so there just aren't those same safety nets. Then they roll out different things, like for old people, they could go and pick up a check on hand, right? But literally then all of the older folks had to go and stand in line to receive it. So it was like you're making them move across the city or move across, and so it doesn't make a lot of sense. I think that, one thing that's going to help Mexico, and I in no way want to romanticize poverty in any way, but is that there is already a great resiliency in our society, and people overcome huge obstacles all the time to feed their children, to take care of the people in their lives. And so I think that that's where a lot of it's that overcrowding where many generations are living in a home that also can help, because then everyone is pooling their resources in order to ensure that everyone has enough to eat. But I know, like here in my community, there's people who are on the road digging out the drainage systems, like where water would flow when the rainy season comes, and they're just asking for donations. And these are just 3 guys who are wanting to work, who need to feed their families. And so it's about all of us also supporting those efforts and recognizing that this is a moment when, if you have extra, we should just be seeing how we can share it.
Wow.
And I think a lot of people just are still working, because that's what you do. You just continue to work.
Wow, that's fascinating. That's a really interesting collectivist approach, which I feel, I want to unpack that so much, but I feel like we've kind of got ahead of ourselves, because but most people are like, yo, so what does this girl do? She's really smart. How does she know all this stuff? Because so what is it that specifically you spend your employment doing?
Precarious employment. No.
Yeah.
So since I was a teenager, I've worked in nonprofits and worked in first I worked in teen pregnancy and prevention, teen pregnancy prevention, and HIV and STI prevention. And then I transitioned later in life into drug policy reform. And that's how we knew each other, from those similar circles of interest. And so I have an organization here in Mexico that's called Instituto RIA, RIA. And we do research and a lot of advocacy about drug policy. So I know Ross from the New Zealand Drug Foundation very well. We see each other at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs every year, which is this nerdy gathering where we all talk about drugs on an international level for a week. So we've been working on drug policy in this very broad sense, not only on reducing the harms of drug use, which is something very important in Mexico, but also about how do we reduce the harms of drug policy. Because in Mexico, while we don't have as high consumption rates as places like the United States or Europe or probably even New Zealand, we are a producing country. Mexico is the second largest producer of cannabis in the world, illegal cannabis. We are the 3rd largest producer of poppy plant to produce heroin, primarily for export to the United States. in the world. And a lot of people's livelihoods depend on these illegal psychoactive plants. And so what we've been trying to do is look at how does drug policy reform, how can it have a development focus and an impact on communities that cultivate, primarily rural communities, and how do we regulate with a social justice focus? So how do we regulate recognizing oppression and privilege, so that I can say that I consume cannabis, for example, but somebody else can't because of the color of their skin or how they look, that we recognize historically marginalized and communities whose rights have been vulnerated, which is primarily cultivating communities here in Mexico, that we apply affirmative actions to those communities to level the balance of justice and power, and that finally we create reparations to those communities. And so when we've been talking about regulating, I know you guys have been having lots of discussions on regulation too, it's not just about creating this new market or, economic development. It's about how do we ensure that we privilege certain communities to be part of this market that already exists. So it's also not just about let's create a parallel system to the illegal system that exists, but rather how do we transit this illegal market where rights have been vulnerated and people have been criminalized and marginalized so that they can be the owners of this new legal industry.
Yeah, because in lay terms, it's gonna be super unjust if rich European descended people who have a legal market and start making millions of dollars from it for selling the exact same plant that in our country, indigenous people in Maori are in jail for doing exactly the same thing, right? How do you have reparations for those people who have historical criminal justice sanctions against them and help them transition into the now legal economy?
And it's about access to credit and money and the skills and recognize, in the first couple of times. I mean, we don't have to only talk about drug policy because then I could go off for hours. But in the first states in the United States that were regulating, I mean, they had in their laws that people with criminal records couldn't participate, which is just crazy because they're the ones who exactly should be participating. And now I think that there shouldn't be any, that regulatory laws should include a plan to excarcerate people who are currently in jail or being criminalized for having some sort of cannabis offense, or they should be able to get their records expunged if they were criminalized in the past. And it's something that's hard to do because, I mean, the excarceration I think is easier to do, but then the privileging a certain group, sometimes I feel like our societies are against that because they're like, well, but everybody should have an equal opportunity. And it's like, yeah, but we didn't have there wasn't equality to begin with. And so it actually, you have to create a higher stepping ground for some groups.
For those who aren't in the know, what is the situation legally with the sale, cultivation, and supply of cannabis and other drugs in Mexico now?
So it's technically decriminalized since 2009, and this means that you could possess up to a certain amount for your personal use. In cannabis, that was 5 grams, which is not very much, and it's a half gram of cocaine, which the illegal market doesn't sell half grams of cocaine. So it's kind of ridiculous. But the 5 grams in Mexico is not much also because we tend to have a quality that is not quite as high as the United States. I'm not saying it's bad quality because we have good quality, but it's you aren't buying 5 grams at a time. You're buying 28 grams at a time because that's what people do. So you technically are allowed to carry up to 5 grams under the law. However, if a police officer finds you, checks you, and says, okay, well then what they do is they take you to the local police station where they're supposed to check if you have any criminal record or some outstanding warrant. And then if you don't, they're supposed to just let you go. What happens in that process is much more complicated because then what actually happens is they just try and get money off of you. So they extort you, the police. Mm-hmm. Or if they think they can get money off of you, they'll even take you to the ATM to take money out. They're so accommodating. Or they'll threaten to plant more drugs on you, because then they have a result in the war on drugs, in the sense of that, oh, I found this young man and he had, 8 grams of cannabis and a gram of cocaine on him. Oh, well, then he's a small scale dealer. That's like immediately your next category. If you have 6 grams of cannabis, you are a small scale dealer, without any sort of case needing to be made about your intent to distribute. So that's how it is now, right now. Over the last, since 2012, a larger strategic litigation process began in Mexico, where a young lawyer named Andrés Aguinaco started taking cases to the Supreme Court. It started with one case called the SMART case, where there were several counselors of a local organization called Mexico United Against Crime. And Andrés Aguinaco took their case under the constitutional right that we have, that is the free development of personality. And he said, cultivating cannabis for your personal use is part of the free development of personality, and the prohibition of that is then infringing on that right. And as well, he made the argument that the prohibition of cannabis has posed a greater health risk to people, to adults, than consuming cannabis. And this has to do with high levels of violence related to implementing a war on drugs and applying a militarized strategy to the war on drugs. So the Supreme Court weighs these arguments, and in November 2015, they say, okay, you're correct, and these 4 people have the right to cultivate cannabis for their personal use as adults without harming others. It doesn't specify a number of plants, and they, can do what they need. But they also, the one vote that was against it in the Supreme Court, the minister voted against it because he said, it doesn't specify where you're going to get the seeds. And so then I've given you this right, but you haven't told me how you're going to exercise that right. So that was like a legal argument loophole that hadn't been thought through when they were thinking about the case. I think everyone was surprised that even the case won. And so then the week that they won, then Andres starts contacting people that he knows, activists and those of us who are in this world, and he's like, can I take cases? Like, I want to take more cases, because in Mexico, to get to jurisprudence so that it becomes the law of the land, you need 5 consecutive cases using the same arguments and getting the same number or higher number of votes of ministers. It's like ridiculous when you compare it to the United States, where you win one case in the Supreme Court and then it applies to the entire country.
You have a precedent, yeah.
Yeah. And so he needed 5 more cases, consecutive cases. And so he got a bunch of us to sign on. And over the next 5 years, actually it was only over the next 3 years, he started winning cases. And so I won a case July 4th, 2018, where then it did resolve the issue of seeds. Like, this regulatory agency has to help you get seeds from a legal distributor in Europe. And a couple of months later, on October 31st, we win our 5th case, which then means it's jurisprudence. And what happens is that then the Supreme Court sends a notification to the Senate and to the Congress to say you have 90 days to change the law, because otherwise the law is unconstitutional. What it found is that the prohibition of cannabis in Mexico is unconstitutional. So they had their time, the deadline, 90 days passed, which when they counted it up and with all the different deadlines was exactly a year later. They said, we don't know enough. So on October 31st, 2019, they were like, the Senate said, we need more time. So then the Supreme Court says, okay, and they give them until April 30th, 2020. And they were on track-ish to get there. They discussed a law. They have the law already written. They passed it in their committees. And then the pandemic hit, and so then they gave them until December 15th, 2020. So it's just like been ongoing. I mean, like, I don't know how many times I need to go to the Senate in my lifetime, but I'm beginning to hit my top. And so that's been the process for cannabis regulation. In other substances, it's much more difficult, because we need to be having a national debate and a national conversation on poppy cultivation. But that we're not there yet. At my organization, we've been doing a lot of research around how Mexico could possibly cultivate poppies legally to then create opium, which is what we make, to make opium, which then we could send to, say, Canada, who's a friendlier neighbor, and they could use opium as a harm reduction measure for people who are injecting heroin that is primarily adulterated with fentanyl, which is what's causing their overdose crisis. So I have this whole idea of like development harm reduction meeting in opium, but that's something that and I feel like this happens a lot, like we have to put out the ideas, we have to generate the evidence, we have to do the studies so that then there's like a threshold and a platform upon which then government officials might at some point come on board. Because otherwise they're scared.
And then, of course, there's also the public relations side of that. Like, you have to make these ideas palatable to, I guess, a more mainstream audience, right? Because that's who politicians respond to. Is that fair to say? I mean, do you have to do that sort of thing? Because the Drug Foundation down here in New Zealand have got, they've really front-footed it with advertising campaign that's in, mainstream newspapers and television, and they're fundraising to, get that message across and have an evidence-based platform. But there's been a real pushback against it from, conservative voices. Is it the same with you?
Yeah, that happens here all the time. There's a lot of conservative voices, including our president, who's quite conservative, even though he's a liberal leftist, but in his heart, he's a very conservative man. Yeah, that definitely happens. And, in the cannabis issue, what helped us a lot was that we had accompanied a case of a young girl named Grace Elizalde, who just last week turned 13. I met her when she was 9, and she has epilepsy, and so she needed cannabis to use for medicinal purposes. And so that helped break open the issue, and then we had the cases, so it became a rights issue rather than and we've said you don't get to vote on rights. Rights they exist, But that's what will become very, very hard when we start to having conversations about other substances, or even about an effective decriminalization of other substances. I mean, there's been, and I understand because it's scary when you have, and you talk about this a lot, but when you have family members or loved ones who are struggling with dependency, it's not easy to take yourself out of that individual situation to see it as a larger societal issue, and to see how prohibition might actually be making it harder for your loved one and for everyone else.
Yeah, that's been my personal journey, because I come from a family with addiction issues and mental health issues. When I was young and listening to the whole straight edge, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it was really militant, like lock up drug dealers, kill drug dealers, sort of.
Yeah.
And I kind
of death penalty for drug dealers.
Yeah. And on an emotional level, when I was a young person, I was like, that makes sense. They're hurting people. But it wasn't until I moved into working in the, professionally in harm reduction that I've gone on this full 180, and I'm like, oh, that does not work, but it's how do you communicate that to people who don't have the time and energy to have necessarily conversations like these, or who are surrounded by other conservative voices, How do you help people understand that changing the law around drugs is actually a compassionate response that will make things better, rather than, I think people think it's going to be like a free-for-all and we're going to be smoking meth in the streets,
Yeah. So that is what people think. Yeah. Well, and because you require nuance to have these conversations, and I know. People, it's hard. I admire all of the folks who are having to do campaigns around this, because like figuring out your messaging is very difficult, because we who work in this are like, no, we should just tell them that, we should be as clear and direct as possible. And then it's like, yeah, but the senora down the street, maybe she's not ready to have that be as clear as you would like. And so you have to kind of build your message. And there was something I was going to say. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's also about recognizing and being clear about the data that 90% or more of the people who use psychoactive substances use them without developing a dependency issue. And that's data from the United Nations. It's not my data. And so, yes, there are people who develop dependency, and they might have developed a dependency to anything that we have around us, whether it's our phone or, you talk about porn or any of these things that we can or alcohol or glue or smoking or and so really it's not about the substance, it's about the circumstances and the situation of the person and how they're addressing it, which is, we always talk about set and setting, and recognizing that also, so that most people who are using drugs are using them relatively responsibly, and oftentimes the largest or the biggest problems that are being generated in their life are being generated by having contact with police or with some sort of public authority, or as a mother, somebody reporting me to child services or something. So it's those kinds of things rather than that it makes me a bad mother or
the fact that, drugs still continue to be illegal, and to buy them, you need to engage in criminal activity. You need to engage with the criminal underworld. You need to engage with characters in that space who often have their own maladaptive coping mechanisms, and there is a greater threat of violence, and that just exacerbates all the problems that you have which lead to your drug use in the first place, right?
Yeah. Well, and that maybe those, because we've also been trying to think about how do we talk about people who deal drugs and take away some of the stigma around that too, because they're a part of this
equation,
illegal framework, and most of the time they're people who are just trying to get by too, and it's probably their part-time job, it's not even their full-time job because they have another real job, even though dealing drugs is also a real job. But and I think this is, we have to figure out how we can have those conversations, and I think by effectively decriminalizing, and I would go further to legally regulating substances, you are going to be able to bring people closer. And I said, we chatted about this recently, like you would bring people closer to the state rather than pushing them away. And that's what because if it was legal and I feel like, oh, maybe I'm getting some habits that I'm not really comfortable with right now. Like I realize I'm coping with something in my life, had a lot of loss in the last couple of weeks, or months, how am I coping with this? Maybe by consuming more. Okay, who can I go talk to? But if it's all illegal, then I'm not going to go talk to anybody. And so it's really about how do we open up spaces to have those conversations. And I've even put forward the idea of under legally regulated schemes, you could have harm reduction workers in cultural centers, no? And they would be the ones who both could be distributing, and they would have a registry if that's how the country was working, but they would be able to distribute and also give tips to that person and have a conversation. And then you begin to facilitate a long-term relationship, where then if the person identifies, or if the harm reduction worker identifies an issue, you can actually talk about it rather than we're just not going to talk about it, which is what we've been doing in our societies.
Yeah, because in Portugal they've got decriminalized all drugs from cocaine to methamphetamine, and that's the model that a lot of people talk about as a positive one, because if you get arrested, then you're put in front of a treatment court,
a dissuasion committee.
A dissuasion committee. Yeah. And they, for those who are unfamiliar, they assess your use and whether it's problematic or not, huh?
That's right.
Do you believe that's a good model, or do you think that there are problems with that?
I think they were vanguard in what they were doing 20 years ago, and they were coming up against an HIV crisis because of using heroin. And I think that they took the proper steps they needed to take. And, I think the big change they did is that they took all drugs-related crimes, those in quotations, crimes, from the Justice Ministry to the Health Ministry. So there was no longer a crime. It was, we're going to talk you through this in a health, social worker, that sort of environment, and not a police officer being the first responder. And so I think that was the big, and the other thing that I think is a big takeaway is when they decriminalized, they didn't put a set limit or a threshold of how much you could carry. It was how much you would use in 7 days. So it's a personalized decriminalization versus, okay, everybody's going to use 3 grams of cocaine or whatever you want to put on there. And so I think that in that way, it was very positive. And I think for the European countries, it's a model that can and should be replicated. Unfortunately, for countries in Latin America where we are producing countries primarily, that doesn't work, because then you're not talking about the production chain and you're not recognizing communities that have been involved in this illegal market. And so that's really the shift, is that people are still having to buy drugs on the illegal market in Portugal. And some of them might be adulterated or not. In Europe, fentanyl has not shown up yet. Heroin continues to flow, and it's not as adulterated as it is in the U.S. and Canada. But for countries like Mexico, Colombia, even Brazil, like we need to be able to talk about how the resources are being distributed along the production chain. And for example, in the case of cocaine, only 2% of revenues stay in Colombia, and the rest is distributed as it moves, as it gets to Europe and as it gets to the United States. And so you think about like a gram of cocaine costs $100 in New York, and a gram of good cocaine in Colombia costs $10. But so how much of that actually stays in those communities? They're not getting rich off of this. And so for us, it's like with legal regulation, you actually have the possibility of ensuring that some of those $100 more of that $100 would stay in those communities. And you could actually get rid of this whole idea of transit countries, because you would be legally exporting and importing a product.
Wow, that is a fascinating equation, because when we think of drug dealers, we think of Pablo Escobar and like, images of Tony Montana and everyone who's like selling cocaina is like rolling in cash and has like a fleet of limousines. But what you're explaining, through the data, which you're incredibly familiar with, is that people are it's like a subsistence living, basically. Like I imagine
people who are growing coca, for sure. And a lot of women are involved in the cultivation. We never speak about them. Anyway, go ahead. You were going to say something?
No, I just imagine that it's like any sort of neoliberal capitalist enterprise where there's perhaps a small pyramid of people at the top who make an exponential amount of cash, but the majority of people are hustling every day to get ahead and feed their families, like you're talking about.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm so glad you brought up the capitalist model, because that's exactly what we're trying to. It's like, how can we make drug policy reform and legal regulation be part of a larger revolution of how we think about these industries? And that's something that it's hard to do, because all of these countries have also signed on to free trade agreements, and we have certain requirements and obligations around that. And we've been having to dive deep into what that means and how cannabis could become part of this. And I apologize, because I'm not a cannabis exceptionalist at all. But it's the substance that is most used, and so it's also most least harms, and so we're moving in that direction. But we do have a larger project in Colombia around regulating cocaine that's called Coca Regulada Paz Garantizada, and we've been working on it since 2016, because we truly believe that, with an organization in Colombia called Acción Técnica Social, and because we believe that Colombia will not be at peace. This was within the framework of the peace agreement. It cannot move towards peace if you don't talk about cocaine. Colombia produces 95% of the cocaine that's consumed in the United States, and it exports it. It's not staying in the country, and yet that is not the richest country, and it could be. And so within that project, like for example, we did a survey with people who use cocaine in the United States and in Europe, and 78% said they'd be willing to pay more if they knew that the cocaine they were consuming was cultivated or produced under some sort of fair trade criteria. So that's also a point. Like, you could even raise prices more to include taxes, to include how you're just splitting up the pie.
Yeah. I was always, I guess from a supply and demand equation, when I started thinking about these things and how do you make them more ethical, I always found it like a strange, I don't know, like an inner city affluent person who might buy fair trade products and be a vegan and stuff, but still consuming cocaine without consideration of the fact that it's a very violent market, and the people at the production side of it aren't getting a fair go and are potentially, subject to all manner of violence,
being killed.
Yeah. I like the model that you present of a fair trade stamp for your drugs. Is that happened anywhere in the world?
It has not happened anywhere in the world, because no one is. I mean, in Mexico, we're starting to think about it around this cannabis model, but it hasn't happened. What you will see in the illegal market currently, and this is more in the deep web, so online, is that there will be people on the deep web who are saying this is blood-free cocaine or fair trade cocaine, but that's not I mean, that's just the marketing.
How do you guarantee that, right? That's
how do you guarantee? I mean, you go to Colombia and maybe then I could, there are people who will say, well, this came directly from the Sierra Mountains, and so it hasn't passed through that. I mean, you get closer to the source, it's probably less violent, less, it's had to go over less rungs to get there, no? And that's the other thing is when we think about like wide scale corruption, I mean, for all of these drugs to be moving around the world, those are like port authorities, it's police on the ground, it's people, it's generals and militaries. It's not like it's all of these people are corrupt. It's the system that then just makes, this is how it works. And so they have to go along, like they do go along with it. And so for us, it's like, let's just take the prohibition part out of it and see if we can restructure this in a more equitable, just, and hopefully with harm reduction so that then people are getting a better quality product. They can make more informed decisions about what they want. I mean, it's one of those things like maybe people don't, and this was my argument with opium, maybe people don't always want to be injecting a very intense substance. Maybe they only want to do that twice a day, depending on what your needs are. And maybe the other 3 times a day when they would have injected a substance, they would smoke a little bit of opium to just reduce pain that they might have or ease their mind or anything. But because the market doesn't even provide that possibility, I mean, there are poppy teas that you could drink a tea that might give you some relief. But it's like the iron law of prohibition is that we move towards the most potent, strongest products because those can be trafficked with the greatest revenue gains and in the smallest packaging. So then we move towards that. But what if I wanted to drink a beverage that has a little bit of cocaine in it because I want to feel stimulation, like coffee or something? I don't really drink coffee, but I want that experience. But I don't want to do a line of cocaine. It doesn't exist. That option doesn't exist. And so it's really also about like providing more options to people, both in the market and the other thing that's gotten big in Europe is like chewing coca leaf. So that would be like the most natural way to consume coca products. I think we have to rethink it all. And I think that this is a possibility to try and remove some of the capitalist tendencies that we have around these industries. And that might show up as like state monopolies on some of these substances like cocaine in Colombia, which I think would be necessary.
I'm curious to know, as I understand it, when NAFTA came into effect, it really destroyed the campesino livelihood of producing crops, even at a subsistence level, which forced a lot of people into the drug trade. Through if you can't make money making producing corn anymore, well, you can do that with marijuana and the supply of other drugs and in this current climate where, as you've said, so many people in the informal economy don't have any economic support, do you think, or do you know if more people are moving towards the drug trade in these circumstances?
I mean, I think it might be the case, although I'm not sure how many people. I think people were already in a precarious place before all of this happened, and so, meaning COVID, so they would probably have already moved in that direction if they were going to.
Sure.
One of the things, but it is what you say is correct, like with NAFTA and with then the explosion of maquilas on the border, so these like manufacturing sites.
Yeah.
These towns were completely inundated with communities and a lot of young people and a lot of children, and they didn't have enough schools to even receive these children. And so these are a lot of people who went to work where then there isn't someone at home to take care of the child when they come home from school because they actually have been displaced from their community to go live someplace where there is going to be greater, in quotations, economic opportunities. And that's something that we saw in a lot of the border towns. And I think, and that's where then you also started seeing a lot of disappearances and violence against women that were working in the maquilas. And there was a clear correlation between those activities. And I think that it's something that in Mexico we do need to be aware of. And we also need to be aware of that in Mexico, there's official estimates are that there's about 250,000 people that are displaced. due to violence, internally displaced. It's probably much higher than that, but these are a lot of people who are displaced because of violence that maybe is caused by organized criminal groups, or because of violence that is perpetuated by multinational corporations who hire groups to do shootouts and to create a violent environment, which will then displace people and allow that multinational company to see if there's mining opportunities in the area or other extractive resource heavy industries. And then you have the state that could be co-opted in helping either one of these two other groups, or that's just there being complicit. And this is where then you generate enough of a sense of confusion that it's like, oh, this is too much. We can't even deal with it. Let's just stop even thinking about it. No? And people are stuck in this, in subsistence.
I just want to come back to what you're talking about with femicide in the maquilas. You have really high rates of femicide in Mexico, no?
Yeah, so in Mexico we have probably some of the. I would have to look at one of these books. We probably have. I mean, before the pandemic, and I haven't seen recent statistics, but 11 women were being killed every day in Mexico. And there's some, and as in general, women tend to be more likely to be killed in the home, whereas men are more likely to be killed in public space. I mean, this is also in comparison to, we would have between 80 and 90 murders a day, and those are primarily men. It's a gender issue for women. It's a gender issue for men because it's putting you at risk either one, right? And yeah, women. It's crazy because on March 8th was the largest women's march in Mexico, and it was huge. I mean, I had gone other years, but I had never seen anything like this. It was just, the city was filled, and it was all women and everyone wearing purple, and it was safe, and it was, and we were protesting because in the weeks before that, there had been several very high-level cases of a man who killed his girlfriend, for example, and then tried to chop up her body to get rid of the evidence. A little girl who was taken from Fatima, who was taken from her school, like picked up from her school. The school had left her on the curb because her parents hadn't arrived on time. Somebody else picked her up, and they took her, and she was disappeared and then killed. And it was a vengeance against the family, is what came out afterwards. But so we had these very high-profile cases, and so everyone was just ready to take the streets. And you saw many more people in the streets, and women from different classes that maybe wouldn't have been politicized, whether that's the upper class or the lower class or lower socioeconomic opportunities. Like, it was just across all spectrums, everyone was out. And we were there on the 8th, and on the 9th we did a women's strike. And so, and it was crazy when you see the pictures or the people who said they went out that day, of like, just that women weren't there, like, what would it look like if we weren't in the public, if we didn't exist? Because that's essentially what they're doing every time you kill a woman, and these 11 women that are killed every day. You're saying, we don't care if you exist. And so we had these very powerful moments in this movement. And then all of this started, and it's like, so now women have to stay in their homes, where they're expected to care for their children, where they're expected to feed people that normally go off to work and they don't have to feed, where they're expected to take on roles. And so we are continuing to see, it's like, this is really the worst case scenario for somebody who's already in
an abusive
a vulnerable
relationship.
Place. Yeah, or abusive relationship, or, lots of family around all the time. And I think that Mexico, we are on the cusp of a revolution around rights generally. And it's both about women, and just that we have not been valuing the lives of women. And we also haven't been valuing the lives of men, because these people who, work in the drug trade or who are part of organized criminal groups, they're also there because they didn't have a better opportunity. They are making a rational choice in their life between being a campesino, working in a maquila, or joining an organized criminal group. And when those are your 2 or 3 or 4 options, maybe you do go with not everyone goes with that choice, because lots of people work in maquilas and lots of people are campesinos. But you can understand why some people choose to go that route, because they see, oh, well, that way maybe someday I'll have a pickup truck.
When it comes to violence in the home and a femicide that women are experiencing, are there movements or government-run programs to help, I guess, counter the deeply ingrained culture of machismo, or like look at reshaping ideas of like manhood and masculinity? Because we're starting to do that here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I see these conversations happening online more and more, and there's some really great, organizations in America that are looking at like how do we dismantle those hegemonic constructs of masculinity. Is that happening in Mexico or in America Latina at all?
It's definitely happening in Mexico, but it's definitely community led and more organizationally led. There isn't some sort of campaign. God willing, there would be a campaign by the federal government to do something like this. But there are, like circles that are starting around new masculinities and what that looks like, and different spaces that are opening up. And my concern is just that those spaces, the people who decide to get online on a Zoom circle or whatever, are people who are already beginning to deconstruct themselves, or beginning to have that opportunity. And so it's like, are we reaching a new audience? Are we reaching the people who are doing that work on the road, those men? No, I don't think anyone is. And it's just a lack of opportunity. I don't think that, it would be great if they were to install this in the curriculum of all 6th graders, 5th and 6th grade boys, and girls. But it's like, we are still living in a super machista society, and when the president was presented with data around the increase in domestic violence calls that the government hotlines were receiving, he was like, oh, most of those are wrong numbers and they're false calls. And then he does a morning press conference every day. In a different press conference, he made mention of that, like, women, well, their place is in the home and they have to take care of the family. And that's just how it works. And it works really well. And that's why we don't have these problems, because the family unit works really well in Mexico. And it's like, you're just ignoring what's going on, and you're not seeing what's all around you. And that's where we also tend to see, like, that laws are applied in very discretional and discriminatory manner. And so when there are high level cases, then you have results, and then the rest of the cases, their access to justice is nothing. And that's where we just need to, I don't know. I think we need a lot of structural change, and it would be great if there was something larger and a larger conversation happening about masculinity and what it means to be a man in Mexico, and a young man, and how do we deal with anger, and how do we deal with frustration, and how do you, all of those things. I don't think men are given those tools, and I don't think that that's changed now.
And like you say, and this is my frustration too, when you see online circles, it's people who already get it, and it becomes like this sort of like, how do I be the most progressive within the circle of people who already get it? Like, I find it really frustrating when you need to talk to like people in the public, just regular people who don't think about these highly nuanced, complicated, academic. And that's a frustration for me.
Well, and that's what I like when I see you going to schools and stuff, because I feel like that's what we need to be doing. And there are organizations that are doing that sort of thing, but I think that as a broad scale public policy, that is not at the top of the agenda.
Yeah, I agree. Where's the hope lie for you? We've been talking about femicide, and we've been talking about mass incarceration. Where do you find your hope? For me, I know being involved in, I guess, the space of desiring social change takes an emotional toll on me. How do you maintain being a partner and a mother and just being a happy, regular person in the world?
Endorphins. Some endorphins when I can. I run laps with my son. No, I think that there are things that are hopeful in that we are seeing changes. While the person who leads our federal government is conservative in his heart, I think there are good people in his government, and I just try and take hope in them. I think that there is a generational cultural shift that is happening across the country that is allowing us to have larger conversations about like same-sex marriage and diversity generally, and about people who use drugs being able to speak about their use more openly and trying to break down stigma. Abortion is also something that becomes more of a public debate. And because we have a lot of, strong progressive people, I think, primarily from civil society, but you see them taking on stronger positions in the public sphere, and I think that's important. And then the other thing is that I and we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, we've been doing this project around peace building. And for me, peace building is kind of like a weird term because it's like, peace building is like the UN coming in and doing, and what we've been working on is like, and that's really negative peace. So that's just sustaining that there won't be a conflict. Whereas what we've been trying to work on is how do we foment and foster positive peace, which is a whole spectrum of rights and opportunities that every person should have, in addition to an absence of conflict. And justice has to be part of that. And so as part of our work with this, we did several workshops with people who are family members of people who've been disappeared during this violent period in Mexico. And I get a lot of hope from them because they're people who are dealing with a pain that none of us even want to imagine, of losing, usually it's their child, their adult child. And they don't give up. They keep searching. And even when they say, I don't have a lot of hope in my case, but I continue to search for others. And so it's this idea that that it is possible to have a reconciliation or overcome these things as a community in the hopes of no repetition, in the hopes that this will never be repeated again. Like, that is the goal. And it doesn't. It repeats every day. But I feel like when you have an objective, and what we've been working on then is like community-based peace building or construction of peace. So it's like, how do I in my personal life construct peace? Well, it is by trying to be a good person in the world and doing what one can. And that is also recognizing the privilege that we have to be able to even do this work, because lots of people aren't able to join in a social justice activity because they're too busy, just trying to make sure that their family is okay. And so I think in a way it does suck a lot out of you, but it also gives you a lot more. And so I think I try and be super grateful for everything that I have, because I know that that's part of it. And also just you have these examples of people who are able to continue on in the face of very high adversity, and they continue. And so it's like, well, we have to march next to them because they don't. That's what you do. Mother's Day. My Mother's Day is now every year for many years now. We've been doing Mother's Day marches of mothers who have had their children disappeared. And it's like, that's how I like to spend my Mother's Day, because for me, it's not a day of celebration. It's a day of protest and struggle, and until every mother knows where her child is. And so I think, it's just feeling a purpose that keeps you going. But there are moments when it's hard because you get down, and then you have to be like, okay, it's okay for me to take a day off and rest, or read a novel, read something that isn't related to our reality, which I think can be challenging. It's just a challenging, it's like both challenging and exciting, and it's hard to decide which one wins depending on the day, because you do feel like things are changing. Like, we're even talking about neoliberal capitalistic models and how do we shift those? Well, that's it.
We have.
Yeah. We're getting there.
Yeah, we are. I think about that a lot. I think sometimes I worry that we've moved away from talking about economics, in our political discourse. And it's incredibly valid that we talk about identitarian issues and those things. We need to have those conversations. But at the same time, it's like, how do we have them both at the same time? Because when I think about drivers of substance abuse or poor mental health or depression or anxiety, there's a lot of data and research which shows us that the broader economic under which we all live, by and large, is one that causes us to feel disconnected, and we are working really long hours, and we are struggling to make ends meet, or we are excluded from the system or the marketplace. And that leads to, well, I'm miserable and I'm going to do these drugs and I'm going to do this and that, and you know what I mean?
Yeah. Or I'm going to harm people around me because I think a lot of it also is like control. And so if you can find control in your own home by controlling somebody, then you feel like you are okay. And that's what we also have to let go of. Like, and I don't think we're given enough tools to deal with these issues at all. And I think about it, like, I'm so glad I had a choice of when to have a child, because if I'd had a child, even in my 20s, I wasn't ready. It would have been really hard for me to have the patience and to know that, no, actually that little person is the most important. And so then you just decide that person. And so I think about people who maybe weren't able to have a choice about when to become a parent, or it's just a lot to deal with. And I think we need to be working on how do we provide better tools for people to make decisions. And part of that is that we have not been giving good information to folks, either whether it's about sexuality and diversity and identity, or whether it's about drugs and substances and how they affect us, or whether it's about like the world is unjust and that the pie has not been distributed evenly. And so then how do we work to level that playing field? I wanted to show you a book, because so I have a good friend whose name is Dawn Paley, and she wrote this book called Drug War Capitalism.
Oh.
Not backwards. And so this looks at like Latin America and how the United States has essentially pushed different judicial reforms or just policies in Latin America as a means of also furthering foreign investment and furthering their capitalist model.
I'm going to go buy that right now. Good plug. Hey,
I have a bunch.
Thank you so much for taking an hour out of your day. Is there anything you want to finish up? I feel like I could talk to you for like hours and hours and hours, but maybe we could do this again sometime, should you so desire. But is there anything you want to leave people with?
No, I mean, Richie, we met because you came to Mexico, and I remember that, and it was great. It was lots of fun, and I think it's important to know that, like, there are very difficult things that are happening in Mexico, but Mexico and Colombia too, I would say, are beautiful, incredibly resilient, kind, generous societies that would welcome any Kiwi that wants to come visit, because it's filled with wonderful people. And I believe in my heart that there are many more of us that are striving for something good in the world, and so we just need to remember that, and that those that are perpetuating things that we might not be in agreement with are less. And so then how do we just continue to push and ensure that the voices for good are getting more bandwidth? So thank you for opening up this space too. And anyone who wants to learn more, I'm on social media.
Yeah, where can people follow you?
Well, I mainly tweet in Spanish, so that's what will be hard, but it's at Zara Snapp with 2 P's, at ZARASNAP on Twitter and on Instagram. But now and then we come out with with academic articles and journals and stuff in English, so you're very welcome. And people who are listening, definitely vote yes in the referendum on New Zealand, because we are all watching you, because I actually thought Mexico would pass our law before you guys would. And so Ross and I were talking about it in March, but you guys in September. I'm wishing you guys the best of luck. I really do think it's an important piece in social justice to regulate, and it's an important piece in creating more cohesive and coherent societies where we can be having these kinds of conversations.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Zara. You're awesome. I've really enjoyed seeing you again and talking with you, and maybe we can do it again in the future.
Yeah, for sure.